this is our next presentation. Roger, we connected via the scientist and artist collaborations that are encouraged by Indiana University. And so we met at the Grunwald Gallery. I think you worked with a number of different artists. Also Margaret Dolinsky, which actually started at IU together with me, and we won't have her any longer. But it was just wonderful, magic to see what you both could do together. And then the next time we interacted was when we had a lot of cicadas descend on Bloomington. And you had a number of, I don't know, BBC or other TV crews come to Bloomington, Indiana. And then you basically guided them to the most amazing spots where the most cicadas were hanging out, making the most noises, and creating really good footage about it all. So thank you, Roger, for being available today. I will maybe just bring up the slides. Or would you like to run the slides? Or
I would like to run my slides because of the way the movies work, but you can.
So let me briefly introduce. Let me briefly introduce you then. So, Roger is a distinguished professor here at IU. He's also the Chancellor Professor of Biology. He received his PhD from Michigan State University and then did postdoctoral research at the University of Illinois in Urbana. And then he was an associate professor of botany at Ohio State University, and also a program officer for grant programs at the NSF, USDA, and DOE. And again, he has been phenomenal in connecting science to general audiences. And I think this is much needed because ultimately our research is paid by taxpayer money. And so those which pay the taxes should absolutely understand what we are doing and should also benefit from what we are doing. And so I'm just in awe of what he has been able to accomplish. And he was ready to join this series, this 24-hour event series today on talking about the intelligence of plants and other life forms. And so I'm super excited, Roger. I'm going to give it over to you and looking forward to see your view of this world.
Okay. Oh, that's my backyard. I like plants, and most people like plants, but most people never pay any attention to the plants. It's a fact of life. I usually start talks when I talk to a more public group, a group that's not just, plant biologists, by showing pictures of plants with animals and asking people to shout out within 2 seconds what's the first thing they see, and they inevitably see the animal. They never see the plant. And that's a phenomenon well documented called plant blindness, which I've been fighting my entire career since I was at the Ohio State University and since I came to Indiana University. So when I was a graduate student at Michigan State, a book got published called The Secret Lives of Plants. This book raised a lot of concerns with plant biologists, and it was a really fascinating book. I read the whole thing like in a day, where they talked about plants having like ESP, plants telecommunicating with people, figuring out what they were doing when they weren't even visible. And it turned out most of it was kind of fraudulent. The experiments were bogus. They just weren't done correctly and so on. But it led to a lot of things. One of those things was it led to a lot of people thinking plants were super intelligent, possibly. And that led to a group of scientists trying to establish a field called plant neurobiology. So they wanted to call a field plant neurobiology while plants have never been shown to have anything that looks like a neuron or resembles a neuron or anything. And it got a bit out of control, and articles started to appear in the press about all kinds of things. There were ethical issues raised by this. If plants can think, should we eat them, and that sort of thing. So there were articles appearing in the New York Times. They appeared in different forms over different years. And, if peas can talk, should we eat them? These really deep ethical questions. And then a scientist wrote a paper called, in Scientific American, wrote a paper called Do Plants Think, which was really good. It was he's a plant physiologist like me, and he just described all these things. And reason through the reasons why plants would do this. And as I'm going to show you through examples today, you can't help but think that they're pretty smart. And Michael Pollan, who's a popular writer, also got onto this when there was this neurobiology push. And he looked into that to see if there was any validity to it. And he came out basically saying, maybe not so much. And I agree with that. And then there was this paper, which came out in the journal from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, entitled, "Do Plants Have Brains?" And these people, the editor-in-chief, pushed me over and over and over again because I have a website that's a lot of plant movies, and I'll show you the URL at the end. And he wanted to use my movies to accompany this article, but this article went on for so long, but before it got to the point that they didn't really believe plants have brains, but no one would read it that far. And I kept having this argument, but it went back and forth for months. And eventually they gave up and went ahead and just published it. And then a few years later, actually recently, last year, a new book appeared called The Light Eaters, written by Zoe Schallinger, who is a reporter. And she'd been writing for years about climate change and so on. And she got interested in plants. She went out and bought botany books, and she ended up traveling all over the world, talking to people who were part of that plant neurobiology group and other people about the things that plants do, and trying to understand this whole issue of intelligence and what we can learn from plants and what, so on, back and forth. Maybe we can teach them something. But she subtitled it with "How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth." And I was really intrigued because my understanding of plant intelligence is, I'll get to that later, is something where everybody should know that plants are intelligent because they obviously survive and have been surviving for a very long time. And that's why my talk is entitled Plant Intelligence and Other Life Forms, the intelligence of other life forms. So I want to talk about a few things. So just a little background. Plants are living organisms. Living organisms grow and reproduce. Plants search for nutrients and light. Light is their source of energy through photosynthesis. They perceive and respond to external and internal stimuli. They communicate with each other. They communicate with other creatures. They alter their local environment. These are all things that something that's really stupid wouldn't do necessarily. So Darwin, who is a person who really put plants into the forefront of our world, studied plants for a very different reasons. Darwin was about to publish his book on the origins of man. And in that book, he was going to talk about the evolution of everything, but one of the things was behavior. And he didn't know what the basic fundamental mechanisms of behavior were. And so he decided that he would study plants because plants are simple organisms. And back in those days, they referred to them as lower life forms. And he studied plant movements for a long time, which is a behavior. So this is the kind of thing he did. It was a little difficult for him to do the plant movements because plants don't move very quickly, as was mentioned earlier. And it's hard to sit there and watch something move when it takes hours for it to do it. And so he developed a system using parallax, and it was very simple, rudimentary system, but it allowed it to amplify the movements. And he had children who he could get to sit and watch the plants, or at least check on them periodically. And so what he did was, you had a plant behind a piece of glass and a piece of paper behind the plant with a dot on it. And then he would identify a part of the plant that they were going to track by gluing a little wax ball to it or something. And the person would sit behind the piece of glass, line up that glass ball with the dot on the reference screen behind it, and mark it on the front glass with a wax pencil or something. and then come back and check it again and do it again. But you have to use one eye. So you're always looking, to counteract the binocular effect and just look at the parallax effect. And if it moved even a little bit, it would be displaced on that front glass if you put the front glass far enough in front of it. And you could mark it. And so his book, The Power of Movements in Plants, which was published in 1880, has about 250 something figures like this, where you see this is where they started, and then this is where it was after, or no, this is where it was the next time. So the dots show where it was, and the arrows indicate the direction. So a part of this plant was moving around, doing things all through the time that they looked at it. So this is in the morning, and this is on the 14th. This is the next day later in the afternoon. So he documented all these movements, and he was trying to figure out what could be the mechanisms behind all of this. He didn't. He tried, but he didn't know enough. He didn't know enough about biology. He certainly didn't know enough about biochemistry. Germ theory was just a new thing, at least acceptable new thing. And so he just continued studying these things, but he never was able to pull together how he thought human behaviors evolved. And again, he was speaking about human evolution in his book about the origins of man. So I'm going to go through a few examples of what plants do, and it will appear that they are intelligent. Plants sense and respond to the direction of light. This is a sunflower seedling that I have a light over here that I turn on and watch it with my camera. Well, I don't watch it with my camera. My camera watches it. I go home and come back a few hours later and see what happened. And you speed this up and you can see it doing something that you would say, if you sat and watched that, you would know that these plants are actually doing things that are pretty intelligent. So the light direction is this way. If you're a photosynthetic organism, you need that light to do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis occurs in all the green cells of the plant, which are, in this case, these cotyledons, these young leaves, and you want to get as much light as possible. If you stay sideways, that light's going to pass right through you or past you. If you tip towards it and put your absorbing surface perpendicular to the rays of light, you will photosynthesize more effectively. Plants figured this out through evolution without any trouble. Gravity is something all living things have evolved with. We grew up on Earth, and Earth has a gravity force that we've defined as 1g, and everything on the planet has evolved in that context. And if you take a plant like this coleus plant, which is a cutting I made, I stuck it in a pot, waited for it to root and start growing again, and then I laid it down on its side, turned my camera on, went home to sleep. And when I came back in the morning, I saw my movie, and what happened during the time I was sleeping, this plant reoriented so that it was growing upwards, which is where the light's going to be coming from, and correcting the problem. That's a pretty smart thing. If you fell over, you would probably do something like that too. They coordinate information. So this goes to what was combinatorial intellectual activity, intelligence. So we have a pot of plants here with corn seedlings that are a few days old. They grew in a drawer in my office in the dark. And so they don't have any real pigmentation to them, and they're monocot, a grass. So the grass has a sheath around the primary leaves, which are hidden inside here. You can see a little lighter spot at the tip where the leaf hasn't gotten to yet. But anyway, the sheath provides protection to those leaves. So when it germinates, it can push through the soil without damaging the leaves. And when it comes out of the soil and sees the light, then the leaves can start growing. But more than that, I took this potted plant, took it out, and I stuck this little nightlight in the center and turned it on, and I went home. And while I was at home, these plants behaved kind of like fundamentalists. They all started bowing towards the light. Every single one of them, even the little tiny guy down here, had bent to the light. And then they start looking like they're oscillating as if they're worshiping the light, which, of course, if you wanted to, you could say, hey, yeah, they worship the light. They are fundamentalists and all that. But you give them enough time and they change color. I came in the morning, 13 hours later, and turned the light off, and they all stood right back up again. without arguing. But they had all turned green. So in 13 hours, these plants did a couple of different things. They saw the light caused them to bend, to attract them towards it in a way, because that's going to be their energy source. And when that light went off, or actually before the light went off, they reached a point where they bent far enough that the gravity response kicked in and they start to go up again. And then they end up in this oscillating behavior, which is what looked like the worshiping. So there's two forces going on here. There's their response to light and there's their response to gravity, and it results in this kind of motion that the plants displayed. So in this period of time of 13 hours, about 2/3 of their genome changed in terms of gene expression. So a whole bunch of genes got turned off and a whole bunch of genes got turned on. Now they're becoming photosynthetic organisms. Before that, they were living off of this food from their mother, and they didn't have much time. So all of these things, I think you would think are pretty smart. This is a sunflower plant, this large plant right here. It popped up in my yard, which is just to my right, outside of the window that I'm sitting next to. And it came from the bird seed. And I let it grow because it was in a convenient position that I knew I would be able to film it. So this is the plant at about 6 in the morning. And you see the leaves are facing towards this side. This is the east. That's where the sun's going to rise. It's already risen at this point, but just barely. So they're prepared. And as the day progresses, you'll see these leaves will change their orientation, and they basically follow the sun during the progression of the rotation of the earth. And as the afternoon arises, they start to move their leaves a little bit more to the west, where the sun is going to be setting. And then they do a really crazy thing and they go to sleep. They all turn down. And by 4 in the morning, they lift those leaves and they aim them to the east in preparation for the sun rising. And when the sun rises, this is a loop. So they continue the same process. They do this over and over again. If you put them in total darkness, those leaves would still do this. So they have a memory of the day period, the photo period. So they can track time of day just like we can. But they don't need a clock to do it. They reset that clock every day when the sun goes down and comes up, so that they are always on the right schedule with the ambient environment as the daylight changes during the course of the growing season. It's a pretty amazing phenomenon. So every time those leaves bend, cells in that petiole, the part of the leaf that is here, have to change their growth response. So to bend down, the cells on the up the top side of the petiole will grow faster than the cells at the bottom, and that will cause it to bend because all the cells are interconnected by their cell walls. And in order to right themselves, they'll have to grow faster on the bottom and slower on the top, and that will get them to straighten out and do what they need to do next. Of course, they get longer each day, and eventually this dampens. So this process of tracking the time of day is called entrainment. So they get entrained to do this. So plants are trainable. People would say that's a sign of intelligence. So in that movie, there's one other thing I wanted to point out. Watch these plants. So they're doing this during the nighttime. They don't do it during the day. They don't do it at night. These guys. They'll start rotating around as it gets dark. Now they're starting to move. So they're actually not just wiggling back and forth. They're actually circling as they grow. This is a process called circumnutation. Plants that do this in an extreme way are things like vines. So these are some morning glory plants that are growing in a pot. And I put a couple of stakes next to them so that they'll have something to climb on. And they will vigorously search for a support in order to grab onto it so that they climb and keep going up towards the light. That's how a lot of vines work. So these guys do a really robust circumnutation. They do a complete revolution of that shoot tip in about 1 hour and 15 minutes. And there's another phenomenon that's going to happen in a second when it hits that one on the right. It senses that through a mechanical sensor in the stems, which causes them to now coil. So they coil onto that, and they'll actually create enough tension that it holds it in place, and then the tip will start climbing further. And if it loses its grip on this, it will start to coil again. So it elongates, and now it's going to coil again. And they just keep doing this and finding things to grab onto and coiling. So they have the ability to search their surroundings. They have their ability to interpret their surroundings. They can feel the touch and change their growth behavior, growth response. Here's a plant that you're probably all familiar with, the Venus flytrap. So the Venus flytrap is a really bizarre plant. They only live in certain locations in bogs, acidic bogs in, I think, South Carolina. And they have this ability to eat insects. So they're carnivorous plants. So this is a leaf. This whole thing is a leaf. You can see this is the petiole, which comes out from the plant down below. And then it has the petiole expands a little bit to give it more photosynthetic surface. And then this part of the leaf does this really amazing differentiation, and it becomes this trap. So we have what look like teeth along here, which are not teeth. They're just extensions from the tissue. This is the leaf face, and it's divided in half. And down through the center, there are specialized cells that take up a lot of water when they're conditioned to do so, to expand it, to build up pressure inside that causes this leaf to separate and open. These three dark spots on this side and on this side are hair cells, or not hair cells, but hairs that are the sensors for the motion. So they're the mechanosensors. And so in this movie, I'm going to tap it. The other movies I showed you were all time lapse. This is a real time movie. So I got a little stick that I picked up, and I'm going to smack it a few times. And you see, it doesn't seem to be paying any attention to this. It probably is, but it didn't do anything. So now I'm going to try to hit the hair, and nothing happens. I hit it the second time, and it closes within milliseconds, 100 milliseconds or something like that. So what just happened here is there are a couple of signs of intelligence here. So first of all, to determine whether something landing in your trap, which takes a lot of energy to open, you want to see that movement repeat. So you hit it the first time, and it activates a sensor inside that hair cell, which causes an electrical stimulus to take place inside the cells. And that electrical stimulus is sitting there now. It changed the membrane potential of the cells, but it hasn't broken a threshold to do anything. If there's a second stimulus within 30 seconds, there's a good chance whatever hit it was an animate object, and it passes the threshold. It opens up ion channels. Ions go shooting out of the cells that are loaded with water. Water goes shooting out behind that, and the thing slams shut. There's a lot of tension built up inside these things. It's like those little toys, those metallic toys that you used to be able to press, and then you lay them down, and eventually the tension releases and they snap into the sky. So the Venus flytrap is really remarkable in this way. It senses the touch. It can sense whether it's the touch of a living thing as opposed to some piece of debris that just fell out of the sky and landed in it. In our greenhouse at the biology department, we often have student groups going through, children from the local schools. And when you go by, you find all these pebbles inside there that they drop in there. But it turns out you have to drop a couple of pebbles to get it to close. So these plants in the greenhouse don't do so well because it takes a lot of energy to keep opening those things and not getting any food out of it. So they sense the mechanical stimulation. And if that mechanical stimulation continues once they close, then they know they've caught an insect or something. And they can tighten that grip. And they keep tightening it until this whole area is completely sealed. And once it's sealed, they secrete enzymes into the inside and digest the insect. And when it's all gone, they open up and you find the exoskeleton of the insect. Really amazing stuff, and I would say pretty intelligent. They get nitrogen in an environment that typically doesn't have nitrogen, as in the acid bogs. Another touch-sensitive plant is this one. It's called the sensitive plant. So it's a mimosa. It actually grows in southern Indiana. And this plant has a really unique response. So here's a leaf. These are leaflets with little leaflets, so subleaflets on it. And this is the petiole that attaches it to the stem, just like this one here. So I'm going to use my fingernails and try to physically activate this response. And you see along each leaflet, you see this whitish area at the base of each leaflet. Those are these specialized cells that can swell up on one side and shrink on the other side by moving water through ion transport, by osmosis, basically. And so in the open case, the cells on the top are more expanded than the cells on the bottom. And if I touch this plant, you'll see right away that a couple of the leaflets closed because the water left the cells on the top. And you see now there's a signal being propagated down that mid vein, which is activating the motor cells in the base of each of these leaflets. Now, that's pretty impressive. It took a little time because I tried to give it a very gentle stimulation. If you whack this, just brush into this plant, all the leaves slam shut in the blink of an eye. So just to show you a little more extreme of this, because this relates to intelligence, I think. I have a flame here. This is a Bic lighter I borrowed, or some kind of lighter I borrowed from a student in my class. And I will bring it over here just below these two little leaflets at the end of that leaf. And right away, they start closing. I gave it as gentle of a heat treatment as I could. And that signal is propagating down that mid vein very nicely. This time it's not erratic like when I bumped it with my fingernails. And it goes all the way to the end. And you think it's over, but there's another set of motor cells at the base of the petiole. And you see the signal got to that and the whole leaf goes down. And now you see it's propagating up into the other leaflets, and each little leaflet is, well, this one's going to start in a second. Each little leaflet is now closing, and it's going kind of slowly because the stimulus starts to fade over time. Now, this is an amazing response because it's electrical based. It's through the same kind of electrical stimulations that occur in our neurons and those action potentials that move along, except now you don't have single cells delivering that information. You have cell-to-cell communication because each cell of a plant is actually connected to the next cell, its neighbors, through plasma desmata, these little junctions that join them together. So in the real world, what happens is if a thing like a grasshopper were to jump onto a leaf, that leaf would immediately do all of what you just saw over that time of this movie. This is real time, by the way. And it closes in the blink of an eye, and that would scare the insect away. So it's thought to be an anti-herbivory mechanism. And if you come up with some method like that, and you're an engineer, you'd say you invented something really clever. And these plants did it through the process of evolution. So Darwin was really impressed by all of these movements. And here are a couple of quotes from his book, The Power of Movements in Plants. It is impossible not to be struck with the resemblance between the movements of plants and the many actions performed unconsciously by the lower animals. So he was pretty sure he was on to something with getting into, what's really going on at the fundamental basis of intelligence and behavior and so on. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that the tip of the radical, which is the root of the plant, he had a lot of things about roots in his book too, having the power of directing the movements of the adjoining parts acts like the brain of one of the lower animals. So he made these references to similarities to animals that the plants displayed through his experiments. And it's easy to see how that would happen. So before I get into that, this is what those people that wanted to have this plant neurobiology group think about. That Darwin even thought these things had brains and neurons and stuff, and which they don't. I'll come back to that later. Never mind. So I mentioned earlier that plants can communicate with each other and they can communicate with other organisms. So I'm going to take you through a little story about a plant communicating with a plant, or a plant communicating with an insect, and an insect affecting the plant in different ways. So this is an interspecies communication example. So many of you have probably seen this. This is a tobacco hornworm, which is notorious for eating your tomato plants, which it's sitting on right now. The plants are in the same genus. The tobacco plant has white flowers on it, usually. The native ones do. And they produce a volatile signal that they emit at nighttime. So this is a graph showing the level of that signal when you go into the dark period, and then the light, and then the dark period. So they do this on a daily basis. It's circadian. And if you put them in darkness, they'll continue doing this for a couple of days. And this signal that they emit is an attractant to a pollinator. That pollinator is the Carolina sphinx moth, which is the mother of the tobacco hornworm. And these things have some very interesting characteristics. So one thing, the tobacco flower has a really long tube, and the nectar is down here. You can see this is the proboscis of that hawk moth. So it slides it into the face of the flower, and then it flies forward and shoves it down all the way down to the base. Now, there was an orchid that also had a very long tube that held the nectar. And Darwin speculated, without ever seeing it, that there would be a moth that had a proboscis that was, I think it was like 8 inches or 9 inches long, which is pretty long. And many years later, that moth was discovered, and it did have a 9-inch or 8-inch proboscis. So it attracts this pollinator. This pollinator will lay an egg on the plant, and that egg might turn into one of these guys, the tobacco hornworm. So it's a 50-50 shot. Some are female, some are male. The males aren't going to lay an egg. They'll do the pollination. The females will do the pollination, but they're also possibly going to lay an egg on you, and that egg might eat you up. So here's a plant that's being eaten. This is a tobacco or tomato plant being eaten by one of these caterpillars. They just munch away and munch away. And while they're doing that, the cellular contents are mixing together, and they're interacting with the saliva of the caterpillar, which has enzymes in it. And the enzymes and all these things, and when they mix together, produce a bunch of volatile compounds that go out into the atmosphere. And one of those volatile compounds, or a combination of them, no one knows yet, attracts a parasitic moth or parasitic wasp. That parasitic wasp is small. It's about 2 millimeters long, and it lands on one of these caterpillars. This guy's blue because he was fed some fake food, and injects an egg into it. That egg divides inside the caterpillar, and in some cases maybe go up to 100 separate eggs from one egg. That egg will then grow, all those eggs will then grow into larvae, and those larvae feed off of the hemolymph of the caterpillar, which is their blood, gets their nutrition from that. So it's not damaging the caterpillar, it weakens it, but it's not damaging it. And they're growing inside. And then eventually they come out. And here, if you haven't eaten yet, well, too bad. This is what happens when they hatch. So this is a caterpillar. I knew he had been infected just from observing him in my garden. And this is what happened overnight. I set him up in a space in my basement to film this. And when I got up in the morning, I saw he was covered with the pupa or cocoons from the wasp. So each one of these white things is a cocoon. Each one of these contains a pupa, which is in a couple of days going to turn into a little tiny wasp that will fly away into my basement and not find another caterpillar ever again. But anyway, this is something that's really common amongst the insects. So there's a couple of things going on here. One thing I didn't mention is that egg cell, when it goes in there, secretes a peptide or a protein into the hemolymph, which shuts off the immune system of the caterpillar so it doesn't know that it's being infected by something, and it allows these things to grow or gives it the ability for them to grow. So it's a complicated system. The plant attracts a pollinator. Sometimes it'll lay an egg there if it's a female. The egg will hatch and the caterpillar starts to eat the plant. The plant responds to the chewing by emitting volatile compounds to attract a parasitic wasp. Once inside the caterpillar, the wasp egg divides. The larvae secrete this viral protein that blocks the caterpillar's immune system. The plant also emits a volatile chemical signal that activates the defense responses in nearby plants. So the plants communicate with each other. This plant's communicating with an insect problem, and it's communicating with each other to warn the other plants around it. All of those things are things that we would say are pretty intelligent. Well, what about other living things? So Darwin studied plant movements simply to test his ideas about the evolution of complex human behaviors. He thought that he could determine the materialistic basis. He would have something to work with to come up with a theory of the evolution of the plants, or the evolution of human behavior. So Darwin also studied earthworms. So I'm going to talk about earthworms because he also wrote a book about earthworms. And he had some pretty interesting things to say about earthworms. So we're familiar with earthworms because on a rainy night in the springtime, you might see these big giant night crawlers crawling around. Or in your compost, you might find these little red wigglers. Or if you're a fisherman, you might go buy those at the bait shop. Or you're a student working in the field, you might find something and say, what is this? Amazingly, an 18 or 20-year-old student did not know that was an earthworm. So Darwin studied these things for quite a while, and he learned a lot of things about them. He grew them in his study in his house, and he and his children would watch them and analyze what was going on. And he determined that, earthworms don't have eyes. You can look as hard as you want. You can never find any evidence for anything that would look like what you would call an eye, but they were sensitive to light. And he saw this by having soil in his study in pots or buckets or something. And when the earthworms would come up to eat and you shone a light on them, they would retract into their little hole. So he thought, okay, they're sensitive to their environment. They don't possess any sense of hearing, but are sensitive to vibrations transmitted in solid objects. So they kept noticing that they had a piano in the study. And whenever somebody played the piano, all the pots that were near there, the earthworms would retract into their little holes. But it turned out that they weren't hearing the music. They weren't hearing the sounds. It was because the vibrations are being transmitted to what they were sitting on. And so if you put them on a cushion and move them a little further away, they didn't care what music you played. He determined they had a sense of taste. He'd take a pot and he'd put food around the edge and see what they ate. And he said, judging by their eagerness for certain kinds of food, they must enjoy the pleasure of eating. So he's now giving them emotions. Intelligence is shown by worms in the manner of plugging and dragging food into their burrow. So when a worm sticks its head out of the hole and it feels around and it finds something to eat, it kind of feels its shape a little bit and it pulls it into the hole in a way that will allow it to be pulled down without getting stuck. But if they want to hide, they pull it in a different way. So if they pull it like a stem of a leaf, they can find the part that's wider and they can pull it down from the thinner part and plug the hole temporarily so nothing can get in and get to them. So all of these things are things that he sort of implies are signs of intelligence, but of course, he knew they were higher up on the evolutionary scale than plants, and so he thought they were more intelligent than plants. And then I like this one, Mr. Simpson, who has a small walled garden where worms abound in Bayswater, informs me that on a calm, damp evening, he there heard so extraordinary a rustling noise from under a tree from which many leaves had fallen that he went out with a light and discovered that the noise was caused by many worms dragging the dry leaves and squeezing them into the burrows. I like this because I was camping with some friends while we were on a bird watching trip, and while we were sitting around in the evening, I kept hearing the leaves rustling, and I eventually looked with my flashlight and I found the worms doing exactly that. So that they were doing their thing, eating. So worms, pretty smart. Well, what about something that's lower on the evolutionary scale? The slime mold. Slime molds are pretty interesting organisms. This particular one is a single-celled species that crawls around and looks for food. So it grows from the tips and it's looking for bacteria to eat on the surface. This is on the glass of an aquarium. And it's retracting where there's no food left. It's bringing its cytoplasm up and recycling it and bringing it back into the active part of the feeding part of the slime mold. So slime molds are pretty amazing, and there's been a lot of research on this. And if you want to see some fun stuff about it, go to this PBS Secret Mind of Slime story. It's really fascinating. It summarizes a lot of research that has been done on slime molds. And what the researchers have learned is that slime molds can smell food, so they have a way of sensing it. They can select the most nutritious foods when given a bunch of things to choose from, just like the earthworms did. They can remember where they've been. They don't go back to where they had been. They can devise the best route to their meals. This was demonstrated in this really interesting experiment that was done in Japan, where they took the map of Tokyo and put agar on top of it, and then placed little oatmeal flakes from Quaker oats, rolled oats, and then inoculated it with some of the slime mold. And over the course of 26 hours, this slime mold spread and spread and spread, and eventually it had found the shortest distances between all of the food in there. So they replicated the Tokyo rail system, the subway system in Tokyo. So this is the actual map of the rail system, and this is what the slime mold came up with. So all of these things are things that you would say are pretty smart or intelligent. So you've probably heard of the Wood Wide Web. We heard reference to it in some of the talks earlier, that there are fungi and things that interact with the plants down in the rhizosphere. And mycorrhizae are a lot like slime molds, and they grow, and fungi do this, and they interact with each other, and they can interact with the plant roots. And they behave a lot like the slime molds. They're pretty intelligent organisms, I think. And now we're going to get to a smaller life form. These are microbes. There's an entire field out there called sociomicrobiology, where people have been studying the microbial behaviors and determined that many of them are actually cooperative and, as you'll see, fit the ideas of intelligence. So there's one called quorum sensing. So this was originally, the organisms are growing, they're dividing and reproducing, and they all secrete some kind of chemicals into their own local environment. And when that chemical reaches a certain threshold point, it changes the gene activity, gene expression of the microorganism, and they start to do things a little differently. They form a different kind of colony, they take on different jobs, and they work as a unit. This is the thing that causes biofilms in medical devices, causes the plaque to form on your teeth, and so on. Is quorum sensing initiates a lot of that. There's many of them that have cooperative forms of motility so that they can form structures and they can form fruiting bodies that will produce spores. They're the biofilms that I mentioned. These are really fascinating things. They can be multi-leveled, but jobs distributed to different levels, but it's the same organism. Each cell does its own thing. And if they just break up, they all go back to being what they were until the signals come along. They can produce things that are considered public goods, microbial public goods, such as obtaining iron from the surrounding soil. Iron is very difficult to get, and so they secrete molecules that actually bind the iron and keep it soluble, so it has a better chance of diffusing towards the microbe. And they can excrete enzymes that digest complex growth substrates, so they get the smaller molecules out of the area surrounding them. So they're very resourceful and very good at finding food. And inside these biofilms, this work is distributed. So this is a schematic of a bacteria. Pretty simple organism. They have a plasma membrane that separates the cytoplasm, the DNA, and all the metabolic activities that occur in that cytoplasm from the outside world. They have a cell wall, and they're pretty fantastic little creatures. They also have, some of them, have these things called pili, these hairy looking things, and then, flagella. which for the ones that are motile have flagellum. So all of these things have the capability of perceiving things in their environment. They're sites of protein receptors. So the bacteria can have many receptors in the plasma membrane that can detect certain chemicals, and that can signal the bacteria that something's happening out there. The pili and flagella can actually sense mechanical forces, and that can change the direction that they move. Bacterial cytoplasm contains all kinds of biochemical signal transduction pathways that take the information from those sensory systems, the chemical receptors or the mechanical receptors, and deliver it to regulate biochemical activity in there, including things affecting gene expression and so on, and can change the behavior of the organism and make them seem really smart. So I would argue that this is really the basis of intelligence, is having all of this biochemical activity that life has evolved over billions of years to allow them to survive in their environment. So all living organisms, they all must be able to acquire energy. For plants, that's sunlight. For these other organisms, the animals, it's the plants or other things in the environment. They have to be capable of sensing and responding appropriately to their surroundings. If it's appropriate, they might survive. If it's inappropriate, they won't survive. So it selects for that intelligent choice. They must be able to differentiate or identify abiotic and biotic threats. There's a lot of threats out in that world for all kinds of life forms, and some of that could be other life forms. So you could be the prey of some other organism, but you have to know what your environment is doing, how it's changing, daylight, temperature, so on. You must be able to coordinate this complex information about what's coming in from their environment. And this is that, I forget who said it. I think it was Jacob, was talking about this transformational kind or combinatorial things that led to intelligent thinking, or one of the creative things. And of course, all organisms must be able to reproduce when the conditions are appropriate. And this is another fundamental aspect of all life forms, is that they have to reproduce. It's a cyclic system. They have to die and go back into the environment so more organisms can grow and keep the system going. So I would argue that all life forms, from the smallest bacteria to the big-brained humans, are inherently imbued with actual intelligence, AI. It's a different kind of intelligence. It's the intelligence that we are based on. It's the intelligence that the big-brained people think is something that's really unique to us, but it's unique to life. It's not just unique to us and the way that we think and the way we should approach things. It is a fact of life. It is life. So, if you're not convinced that plants are intelligent, just read this quote. A big elm in a single season might make as many as 6 million leaves, wholly intricate, without budging an inch. I couldn't make one. That's from Ann Dillard's Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And, I agree. I can't make one either. And I bet you none of you can make one. And I'm quite certain that AI, in terms of artificial AI, cannot make one. Ever. And I don't think any system is going to be able to reproduce life without millions of years of evolution to do it. We may replicate life from life, but we won't be able to evolve a new kind of life form, because I don't think we'll make it that far. But I have other reasons for that. So if anybody's interested, I have a website called Plants in Motion. The URL is right there, and it has a whole bunch of plant movies on it. It disappeared for quite a while when our university lost all of its web activity for some time. It just got reactivated a couple of weeks ago. So it does work again. It's a little crude, but it works. And I added one other thing because I was really fascinated by the last talk. And that last talk about the system. I have a lecture I gave after I retired in 2003, so almost 3 years ago. So it was in January of 2003 that I entitled The Buddha, the Bodhi Tree, Science, Us. And in that talk, I looked at what are the fundamental things required for life. And it identifies, without having to do anything with AI or a computer, what it is that is causing the biggest problems in the world and that we have to address if we want to survive. And that is basically the cyclic nature of every aspect of life. We as humans are the only organisms on the planet that go with the idea that we can have continuous growth. And it is going to kill us. So if you're interested, you can go look at that. I put it on YouTube. If you watch it, do not show it to IU students. I say some things in there that would not allow me to be active on campus anymore under today's stricter guidelines for language. So I'm happy to take some questions. I see I left about 10 minutes so that we can have some questions.
Roger, thank you so very much. I think very thought-provoking. And I realize that I now also oftentimes have to pause in my presentations because certain things have to be reinterpreted. And still, I think we really need to act very quickly and understand very quickly. So I especially enjoyed the complex interdependencies between the tomato worms, and I have many of them. Every single year, almost all of my tomato plants are in trouble. And I don't think it was host for these moths, which you showed us so vividly. So my tomato worms are just fine and happy and just eating my tomato plants. So I think these very complex networks, have you seen visualizations of this? I know we have one submission to this year's iteration of the Envisioning Intelligences exhibit, which actually looks at these complex interdependencies, and your comments on it would be super. I see Todd Theriault here, who will moderate that session with that team which created the visualization. Maybe he can even put the link into the chat. I always have a hard time reading and typing. But I think it's super important for us to understand how interdependent we are with the many different life forms that exist on our planet, with the microbiome that's inside of us, with other human beings that have a huge impact on how happy or depressed we are. And I believe we need to figure out a way, as Adam pointed out, not just to have people understand these interdependencies, but to really feel them and act on them. Yeah, so Todd put into the chat the zoonotic web, and maybe I can even bring that up just to get people interested to stay after midnight, and also for you to get interested to ultimately, let me clean up my screen for you.
I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah. All right. So maybe I can just here. So now I can share. So this is a scrolly story which you have to scroll downwards to see the many different zoonotic agents, and then you get stories told about these different agents. And I think it's a very neat way to guide people through the complexity of all of it. I think Adam Blei was asking for new ways to communicate quite a bit of complexity across temporal scales, across spatial scales, across the different life forms, across the different human physiological systems to general audiences, right? That's what we are trying to do here in the third iteration of the exhibit, but also in much of the research we have seen today. And so how would you go about this in a way so that normal human beings, which are not researchers necessarily, can really understand all of it? And so again, we will have the team which is responsible for making this visualization join there from the Vienna Complexity Hub, which is a really cool team which studies complexity at scale, having a lot of amazing researchers right there working together on much data that has just recently become available in a digitized form. And then this particular team, they are working with many of the experts to then visualize the key results of that work and that insight. So yeah, I think it would be great to get your comments on this, but also to get pointers, Roger, to other teams that have started to use data visualizations to communicate this great complexity.
Yeah, no, it'd be fun. Yeah, so my approach is a little different. It's like look for the fundamentals of a system and then look across scales. The same fundamental this is what I did with all of life. All of life is cyclic. The Buddha told us that. That's why the title of that talk. And by looking at all the systems, you see there's cycles every place. Your biochemical systems have cycles in them, and those cycles are really interesting. Some of them are for feedback loops. Some of them are critical for making something that keeps the system going. And if you break that, the system dies. Yeah. So our respiratory system, loaded with cycles. Every biology student knows that because they had to learn the Krebs cycle or the TCA cycle. Plants do photosynthesis. They have the Krebs cycle. Every plant scientist has to learn the Krebs cycle, or the Calvin cycle, sorry, not the Krebs cycle, for how carbon is fixed. And carbon can't be fixed if you don't remake one molecule every time a carbon molecule is captured. You have to remake the thing that captures it. And humans don't put anything back into the earth. Humans put everything, well, they do, but it's buried in a sealed, hermetically sealed landfill with tons of toxic stuff that we've made. And we don't return to the environment. And you can't keep doing that because the plants need those nutrients to grow. So if you don't do that, if we don't learn how to do that, we cannot persist. It's just not possible. And I don't think AI is going to teach us how to do that. We have to change our behaviors. So if you can get AI to help people change their behaviors, to start behaving like the thing that they are, which is a biological organism in a more complex biological society, we're not going to make it very long.
Yeah, I think AI is currently learning how to get more and more eyeballs, and they get that by spreading bad news instead of good news, because it gets us more nerve-wracked and more aggravated and more attention. There is another great question by Peter Todd in the chat.
Yeah, saw that.
Terrific talk. Yes, this was a great talk, and then great to see plants engaging in search too. So Peter Todd talked about search, connecting with his earlier talk. And then for tobacco plants, they want the moths to pollinate them, but not their caterpillars to eat them. So how do they balance between the two factors?
Obviously, it works. They can still survive and reproduce, and they have to have the reproduction part. So the pollination is essential for the plant. They have to have pollination. So it's a risk getting the female moth to come and possibly lay an egg there, but 50% of the moths won't be females, approximately, and they won't lay eggs. They'll just pollinate. And so in the long term, it's usually enough. The other thing is, these parasitic moths, when they get to that insect, by the time they get to that insect, at least the one I showed you, is already a gigantic moth or a caterpillar, and it eats a lot of plant material in a day. In fact, that one caterpillar I showed the movie where the larvae were popping out, I brought it in the house and set it up in my basement with a piece of tomato plant that was like that big in a vase. And the next morning, the plant was gone. All the leaves were gone. The stem was there and the caterpillar was still on it. So I got a new one for the next day. And the second day, finally, the things emerged, thank God, because I was running out of tomato plants at that point. But anyway, I had 100 little wasps flying around my basement for a while. It was fun. So yeah, it's a tricky thing. Almost every insect has a parasitic wasp that will attack it. There are also fungi that attack them. All these things. I mean, life is, the little guys get eaten by the big guys, and the little guys eat each other too. The bacteria are eating each other. There's all this stuff going on out there. But if you don't recycle those basic fundamental elements of life back into the environment, it's not going to be a good environment. And we already see that. Instead of putting things back in the environment, we put new things in the environment, highly toxic things, and we know they're toxic, and we allow it to go back in the environment with the caveat that we'll monitor the situation. That was just the new announcement from the EPA that they're going to allow something like 3 or 4 new forever chemicals to be used in agriculture, even though forever chemicals have been shown to be really bad things to have in the environment. They're just going to monitor the situation.
I think we can do better than that.
Well, especially when you killed the EPA, you're making them not do anything except stuff like that. So it's a really sad time. But
so Roger, I think it's wonderful to have you here because we all agree and we're all here because we believe we can make a difference. We can take the data we have, we can interlink it, just like the system talk we just saw. We can visualize it, we can try to understand what the dependencies really are and see how fragile we all are and how fragile the system is.
It's been really interesting. Listen, I listened to almost all the talks today.